Study Section 8. Nigeria's Foreign Policy During the Murtala Obasanjo Regimes. Introduction. In this study session, we shall focus on the conduct of Nigeria's foreign policy during the regime of Murtala Mohammed and Olusegun Obasanjo. It examines the features, challenges, and achievements of the administration in the conduct and administration of Nigeria's foreign policy. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study section, you should be able to 1. Highlight the basic features of Nigeria's foreign policy under the Mohammed Obasanjo regime. 2. Point out the achievements recorded by the regime in Nigeria's foreign policy administration. 3. Highlight achievements recorded by the regime in Nigeria's foreign policy administration. Features of Nigeria's foreign policy under the Murtala Obasanjo regime. The military coup of 29 July 1975 gave way to the Mohammed Obasanjo administration. At the domestic level, the regime embarked on the task of salvaging the nation from the chaos and confusion which it inherited. Amongst its various tasks, the regime embarked upon a full-scale review of Nigeria's foreign policy and its conduct. A panel headed by Professor Adebayo Adedeji was set up to do this, and it produced a report which included an overall review of Nigeria's foreign policies since independence and its projected objectives, priorities, and strategies for the following decade. During this regime, Nigeria applied a more militant approach to the liberation of South Africa and other African countries under colonial tutelage, played assertive roles as a black African leader, diversified foreign relations with both Eastern and Western blocs, and promoted regional integration in Africa. The regime made a sensationally radical departure from the conservative tradition of Nigeria's foreign policy. This was demonstrated in its reaction to the Angolan Civil War. Murtala Mohammed inherited an Angolan policy which favored a government of national unity consisting of elements from the three major liberation movements which had fought the Portuguese for over a decade. The three liberation movements engaged in the civil war in Angola were UNITA, FNLA, and MPLA. Nigeria was opposed to the United States, which supported UNITA and FNLA by strongly backing the MPLA through military, material, and diplomatic support, and going ahead to mobilize the rest of Africa behind that position, even when the OAU was still hesitant. Nigeria therefore broke with the tradition of basing a position on African issues strictly on OAU positions. The triumph of the MPLA, which formed the first government of the newly independent country, justified Nigeria's expenses for the support estimated at over $20 million and marked a major defeat for U.S. foreign policy in Africa. For the first time, Nigeria and Soviet Union stood on the same side of the fence on a major political issue, while the West stood on the other side. The dramatic recognition of the MPLA established Nigeria's claim to leadership and brought the nation considerably prestige and acclaim. It was also a popular move with the Nigerian populace. Nigeria took advantage of the high level of national and regional unity which the Angola issue evoked and embarked upon the articulation of a new direction in foreign policy in which Africa was defined as its centerpiece. Nigeria's South African policy became more pronounced as the regime continued to provide material and diplomatic support for the liberation movement. It was also ready to take on any country that refused to support efforts to end apartheid in South Africa and Rhodesian Zimbabwe. Nigeria put pressure on foreign companies operating in the country to pressurize their home government to impose sanctions on South Africa and hasten negotiations for the end of apartheid. After the assassination of Murtala Mohammed in an abortive coup on 13 February 1976, General Olusegun Obasanjo became head of state. By and large, The Obasanjo administration, in substance, if not in style, appropriated the attitudes and policies of Murtala Mohammed's regime. The Obasanjo regime did not relent from the cause of the liberation of Africa. Declaring itself a distant frontline state, Nigeria became more proactive in a Southern African policy. The regime amassed all the diplomatic support and material forces it could muster in support of the fight for majority rule in Rhodesia. Nigeria prohibited South African immigrants in Nigeria, imposed total trade embargo, accommodated liberation leaders who escaped to Nigeria, gave open support to the liberation movement, armed struggle, and withdrew from the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games in 1978 to protest New Zealand's sporting contact with South Africa. On Rhodesia, the Obasanjo regime nationalized the assets of British Petroleum and Barclays Bank in Nigeria in 1978 as a reprisal for the sale of oil to the regime of Ian Smith. The regime amassed all the diplomatic support and material forces it could muster in support of the fight for majority rule in Rhodesia. In the global environment, Nigeria discarded a former quiet diplomacy. It represented the African continent in the negotiations of the Lomé Conventions and made vigorous demands for a new International Economic Order (NIEO). Nigeria joined other third world countries to demand restructuring of the IMF, the World Bank, and GATT, which perpetuated Western hegemony. It made economic overtures to the Eastern Bloc and sanctioned the presence of Cuba in Africa. Achievements of the era. Nigeria's diplomatic successes in the 1970s, which were largely due to the oil wealth and dynamic leadership of the Mohamed Obasanjo regime, were exemplified by Angolan independence over American opposition and the nationalization of British Petroleum (BP), which was believed to have contributed to Zimbabwe's independence. The period of the 1970s and 1980s was generally the high point of Nigeria's new activist and interventionist foreign policy. Nigeria emerged the most important, most prominent, and most influential power in Africa, which made the West court the country. Liberation movement looked up to the country for diplomatic and financial support. African countries relied on it for financial assistance, and international organizations looked up to it as the most credible and solvent country in Africa. Nigeria could be relied upon to pay its dues on time. Foreign investors saw Nigeria as another Brazil, and investment opportunities seemed endless. Some analysts have attributed Nigeria's militant and dynamic diplomacy in the 1970s to the regime change from civilian to military, the oil boom, and loss of the dynamic leadership of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. Apart from the fact that the buoyant economy made a vibrant foreign policy practicable, the favorable international environment was also a factor. The military culture of administration that allowed for little bureaucracy when compared to a civilian regime also facilitated proactive foreign policy. The personalities of Murtala Mohammed and Obasanjo could not be ignored. Before becoming Nigeria's head of state, both men had belonged to the Nigerian Society of International Affairs (NSIA), and by their membership of this organization had been involved in the internationalized intellectual exercise of Nigeria's foreign policy and involvement. Other factors that contributed to Nigeria's dynamic diplomacy during the period include the open-mindedness and confident nature of the foreign minister, Joe Garba, the availability and use of a confident and boisterous non-governmental foreign policy elite in academia and the press, and the fact that opportunities presented themselves and Nigeria was awash with a surplus of funds she could apply. Challenges of the era. However, Nigeria's external economic relations continued to be in the direction of the West, and the US remained the single largest consumer of Nigeria's oil. Nigeria's militant policy during this period is sometimes castigated for neglecting the country's economic interest because of its radical attitude towards companies from countries that had links with South Africa. Studies section summary. In this studies section, you had an overview of foreign relations under Mohammed Obasanjo regime. The period witnessed a dramatic radical departure from the conservative tradition of Nigeria's foreign policy. For the first time, Nigeria and Soviet Union stood on the same side of the fence on a major political issue, while the West stood on the other side. The period of the 1970s and 1980s was generally the high point of Nigeria's new activist and interventionist foreign policy, and it had the status of a frontline state. However, Nigeria's external economic relations continued in the direction of the West. Nigeria's militant policy during this period neglected the country's economic interest. This is the end of Studies Section 8. Thanks for listening.